Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks. Today we're going to do a screencast on the Great War, although most people refer to it as World War I. Apologize, I have a little bit of a cold, so my voice is a little limited, but we'll do the best we can. So this presentation is on the basics of World War I. You know, the causes and its conclusion. We're not going to go too in-depth on any one topic. Now that said, why don't we dive in and begin? So when did World War I begin? And that, of course, is 1914, near the beginning of the century. It's going to kind of transition out of the progressive era in the U.S. and end that period, and it's going to last for about 4 years. Now, it's going to take about a full year to clean this mess up. That's going to be at the Paris Peace Conference when they make the Treaty of Versailles. This is going to be an awful war. It's going to take a lot to clean it up. So it's going to be called the Great War. And why don't we refer to it as the Great War anymore? Because Hitler came along from Germany in World War II, and it made no sense to call World War I the Great War, because World War II was even a greater war. Longer, more death, more destruction. So at that point, they're like, well, let's just call it the World War I and then World War II, since we had two great wars. So basically, this was the first war that involved such a high percentage of the world. That's why it's called a world war. It wasn't just 2 or 3 or 4 countries. It was people from all the different hemispheres. So many were involved, as you see the countries shaded in black here. It was truly a world war. Now, World War II would even involve more countries, but still. 9 million plus dead, and that's a lot of people from across the globe. So, this war is considered a massive failure. And of course, if you experience a massive failure, some people say it's only a failure if you don't learn lessons from it about how to improve in the future, how to experience success. So why did this happen? Why did we get stuck in this war? If we can figure out the why, maybe we can figure out how to avoid it. So reason number 1, militarism. Militarism was on the rise, and we can blame World War I on that. In 1914, Europe was infected with this philosophy called militarism. Now, it had been building up for some time. Now, what is militarism? Militarism is when a culture suddenly starts to think that war is awesome. They love war, the glorification of war. There are many things that a culture can fall in love with, but war is one of them. So we can all think about people we know that are a little more militaristic than others, quicker to fight, more aggressive. Well, countries are the same way. And they're in the world, particularly Europe, started to think that war was awesome, amazing, to the point where they weren't thinking about war from terms of death or losing loved ones or injuries or amputations or blood. No, that wasn't what they thought of when they thought of war. They basically thought of war as being glorious, about winning, creating empires. And that form of militarism is going to have consequences. Now, why were they so clueless? Why did they have such a one-dimensional way to look at war? The last major war in Europe had been the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, I believe. And that was between Prussia, soon to be Germany, and France. Most people by 1914 had not experienced war, not the political leaders, not the generals. They were all in for it. So again, they were babies when the last war happened. So all they knew about war was what they saw in history books. What they saw about war was glorification of George Washington storming across the Trenton and basically beating up the Hessians and winning freedom for his country. And that sounded glorious. Napoleon making an empire, and everybody loved Napoleon. They didn't talk about all the death that his armies led to and all his people dying. No, it was about empire creating. Schools would have students create poems about such things. So textbooks would be dominated with heroes that used to conquer. Think about it. If you look at a history textbook, all it is these empires and conquerors, and it's so glorified. Movies, all made about these battles and heroes come out at the end. Songs are written about these wars and these battles. Ceremonies, how we honor the people that lead our wars. You couldn't help but growing up and loving war, wanting to be involved, wanting to be a hero. As a result, countries of Europe and the Western Hemisphere just loved war, dived in 100%. So militarism results in countries wanting to fight. And now, militarism can't be that bad, but how did it lead to World War I other than just a basic love of fighting? Well, the answer is militarism tends to lead to a love of war, so you need to be prepared for war. So you start building up your military, and of course, people enlist in that military. Now that you have a large, well-prepared military, like Germany in the early 1900s, suddenly, bam, you have a large military. All the countries around you start getting scared, and they should be scared. So what do? They start building up even larger militaries than you have. What does Germany do? They build an even larger military. And then the other countries build an even larger military than the military you're going to build when you hear that they're building a larger military. This is called an arms race. There's no win here. Both sides you can never have two winners. Everybody just has to keep building up arms, keep enlisting people in their military until they are absolutely militarized and ready to go. Now, militarism leads to arms races. Now, why does an arms race lead to war? Well, if you have an average country like this poor fellow, and if he's threatened, he'll often, by somebody like this, a very militarized and strong person, he would often run away. Now, that's a very natural flight or fight reaction. The thing about this is that actually prevents war when somebody runs away and tries not to be tough and doesn't stand up to people. However, if the bully attacks somebody, and instead of having a weak country, you have a militarized country, everybody's strong, everybody's got a strong army, now all of a sudden you're going to have war because both are prepared for it. And that's what militarism did to Europe. It got everybody so tough and so strong and so confident and so ready to fight. If you're a hammer, all you see is nails everywhere. If you have a massively strong military, you're going to see the use of that military for your solutions. So in 1914, Europe was militarized, the strongest armies everywhere. And when you're heavily armed, bam, you are ready to go. You're ready to fight, and that's what the militarized world led to. So how can we use this lesson to improve the world? Well, notice if your country is being militarized, notice what your military budget is. Notice what people think about war. Are they focusing just on the glory? When they talk about conflict, does militarized solutions dominate the conversation? Because there are so many other diplomatic choices as well. So again, a militarized society or multiple militarized societies is definitely an issue that led to World War I. You should be cognizant of that and recognize the militarized side of your society and keep it in check. Now, there's certainly a role for the military and certainly a role for being militarized, but it cannot absolutely dominate all discussions about how to have conflict resolution internationally speaking. Now, that said, reason number two why World War I happened. Not just militarism, but imperialism. Now, naturally, if you are militarized and you have a strong military, that's going to lead itself to imperialism. Basically the spreading of your influence and dominion over others. Now, in the 1800s, Europe had an industrial revolution, went through that, and that led to a lot of factories versus farms. And now those factories needed raw materials to put into those factories to make products. Now, how do you get them? You could trade, absolutely. You could buy them, but it's just so much more advantageous or easier to take from others rather than giving up your money for them. So the idea was imperialism in the 1800s was huge. European powers who had an industrial and advantage of technology started conquering weaker powers, and by weaker I mean in the criteria of technology and your military might. Britain had the largest empire, but all these European powers, or many of them, had empires. Now, imperialism leads to war because when you go out and conquer and compete, you're going to go after land that others want. And that type of competition is going to lead to war. It's going to lead to some countries protecting their allies, and ultimately that is going to lead to World War I. Now, an example would be 1871. In the Franco-Prussian War. The country of Prussia, that would later become Germany, was trying to unite and essentially gain power for itself and gain land. And they are going to attack France, and France is going to attack them, and they're going to battle all in the hopes of getting land. Now, in this Franco-Prussian War of 1871, Germany won, and they're going to take a huge piece of land from France, Alsace-Lorraine. To the victor goes the spoils. And there's that land they took from France. As Germany took it, this is going to create resentment, anger. All France could think about for 30 or 40 years was how to build up their military so they could sometime get revenge, defeat Germany, Prussia, and take that land back. Now, that everybody was itching for revenge. And they were also itching to expand their empires, right? So not just militarism, but the imperialism is going to lead to World War I. because every country is going to want to fight to conquer land, expand their empires, and get revenge for past injustices. So imperialism leads to a desire for revenge, and that led to World War I. Imperialism, of course, a desire to expand your empire. Now, reason number 3, besides the rise of militarism and the actions of imperialism that led to World War I, is the rise of nationalism. Now, nationalism is basically love for your nation of people. Now, people identify in many ways, but the way they identify and their loyalty throughout history has often been to their king. People were almost owned by their king, and their king was their leader, and they identified as being part of a kingdom. Now, other ways that people identified was through their church. They saw themselves through the paradigm of God. Others saw themselves or identified as part of their country. I'm an American. I love the United States. I will fight for the United States. But in the 1800s, a wave of nationalism spread. Now, the difference between nationalism and basically love of your country is, in theory, you could have a nation of people, let's say the Serbs or the Germans or the Americans. You could have a nation of people that are, half of them are conquered and in a totally different country with a different government, a different king. But nationalism is when you identify your group of people. You're Slavic, you're Serbian, you're German, and your loyalty is to them, not necessarily your government or whatever country you're a part of. So this wave of nationalism, this pride in your people, is going to lead to, in the 1900s and 1800s, this wave of revolutions. Let's get rid of this evil government that's conquered us. We deserve to be free, the Serbian people. Now, nationalism also leads to the support of other people. For instance, if you're in Russia and consider yourself Slavic, and you want to free the Serbs because they're Slavic, then you're going to fight to free them from the Austrian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. Nationalism leads to the drive of empire because when you have pride in the Germanic people, you want to make sure that you're the winning team, you're the best ever, and sometimes empires signify that. So, we want to beat the French, we want to have the best empire ever, we want to be the strongest group. So nationalism leads to the idea of revolution, but also supporting revolutions, but also trying to expand your empire. And of course, when you combine racism with nationalism, that often leads to genocide, like the Turks on the Armenians or the Germans later on. But basically, when you get to the point where we're Americans, we're the best, you immediately are saying, well, Americans are the best, others aren't. Well, what does it mean to be American and who doesn't fit? So a lot of times hyper-patriotism or hyper-nationalism can lead to racism and prejudice, and we want to be very aware of that. Regardless, in addition to the militarism and the imperialism, growth of nationalism in the 1800s is going to lead to war. The best example is in the Balkans, the area of southeastern Europe. Basically, there's going to be a group of people there that have been conquered and dominated for 500 years by the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire is going to own them. But the Ottoman Empire is going to be called the sick man of Europe in the 1800s, basically weak. And it's going to start losing all these areas in the Balkans. They're all going to fight, win their revolutions, and become free. But there's one valuable area in there that is still kind of unstable in the early 1900s, and it's going to be called Bosnia. Bosnia is located right there. And Bosnia is a wealthy area, relatively speaking, and there's going to be two groups that want to conquer it now that the Ottoman Empire is out of the picture. Now that's going to be Austria-Hungary, and that's also going to be Serbia. They both want Bosnia. Now, what is their motivation? Austria just wants a stronger empire. They want to grow, imperialism. Serbia wants to be free. The Serbs know that in Bosnia, a high percentage of the Bosnians are Serbs. They just happen to be owned by a different government. So the Serbs, with this wave of nationalism, want to make this huge country called Serbia. So they want all the Serbs united. They don't care necessarily about their church. That's not the priority. They don't necessarily care about their country. They care about their people. They want a country to be about their people. Now, who actually ends up getting Bosnia, which is filled with tons of Serbs? Is it Serbia, who wants to unite all the Serbs in a wave of nationalism? Or is it Austria-Hungary, who wants to take over this land in a fit of imperialism? Well, the answer is, in 1908, Austria-Hungary annexes Bosnia. They take it over. They add it to its empire. Now, at that point, when they invade and take it over and conquer it, Serbia gets angry. They see this as not just land conquered, but their people being enslaved. Now, Serbia can't do anything about it because it's a mismatch. Serbia is just not as strong as Austria-Hungary. So instead, what do you do when you can't stand toe-to-toe with someone? Well, you embrace kind of guerrilla warfare, or you embrace terrorism. That's exactly what happens. The Black Hand is formed in Serbia, a terrorist group that's going to kind of try to undermine Austria-Hungary's control over Bosnia. So they're saying mantra is union or death. That's what the Black Hand is, union or death. They want the Serbs to unify, and they were willing to die to try. That's the goal of the organization. Now, they're going to do lots of things, including acts of propaganda, but they're going to do acts of terrorism to harass Austria-Hungary to let their people go. So in 1914, Franz Ferdinand, who's the Archduke of Austria-Hungary that now owns Bosnia, Archduke is basically the leader that will take over when the emperor dies, kind of like a vice president in the US. Now, going to Bosnia, what's going to happen is Austria-Hungary now owns Bosnia, so they send Franz Ferdinand, or he goes to Bosnia basically to cheer on his people. So he goes to the capital Bosnia, which is a city called Sarajevo. He's going to visit it right in Bosnia, and there he is, Franz Ferdinand with his wife Sophie, getting into a parade car, and he's going to do a little parade through Sarajevo to wave to the people he's conquered. The Black Hand immediately dispatches 6 assassins. Now, this all takes place on June 28th in Sarajevo. Here's the parade route in Sarajevo. And the target, of course, is going to be not Gavrilo Princip, but Franz Ferdinand. There he is, right there, next to his wife Sophie. And at 9:50 a.m., he's going to approach the first assassin. Now, that assassin is armed with a gun and a hand grenade. Now, is the assassination successful? And the answer is no. They basically kind of wimp out. They don't gain the courage. They see Franz Ferdinand drive by, and they're like, yeah, I'm not up to assassinating anybody. Apparently, they didn't have the courage, or maybe they had the common sense. A few minutes later, 10:10, the motorcade gets to the next assassin, basically the third assassin, since the first 2 backed out. And that one actually manages to gain the courage to throw a hand grenade, a bomb, at Franz Ferdinand. Now, the person in the front seat reaches up and smacks the hand grenade out of the air. Would have been good at baseball. And launches it towards the back. It explodes under the following car. Now, about 20 police and bystanders were hurt by this explosion, but the hand grenade was deflected away from Franz Ferdinand. He was totally fine. Now, the assassin immediately pops cyanide and escapes to the river. Once again, this is Sarajevo. Jumps in the river to get away from the crowds. And there's the actual river that they dived into. The bad luck was that this river was super massively shallow and not exactly the easiest place to hide in. So he gets captured immediately by the crowds that are trying to defend their leader. Now the mob attacks him and beats the really hell out of this guy, this assassin. Now you would think that the assassin's going to die, but it turns out the cyanide wasn't all that effective, just made him absolutely violently sick, but didn't kill him. Now while all that's going on, Franz Ferdinand leaves. Somebody just threw a bomb at him, gets out of there. Now, Gavrilo Princip is one of the other 6 assassins. Now, he's frustrated. He sees Franz Ferdinand fly by. He's like, well, I can't assassinate him now. So he actually goes into a cafe to go get a sandwich. That's what Gavrilo Princip does. He's about 19 years old, I think. He's getting a sandwich. Franz Ferdinand is angry. He's fled away in his car. Yells at the mayor, why couldn't you protect me? These are my people. This is outrageous. Now, Franz Ferdinand eventually calms down, and he says, you know what? That grenade that was meant for me hurt a bunch of my people. I'm going to go to the hospital to say hello to them. That's the right thing to do. Many have died, many are dying, many are hurt. I need to thank them. So let's see where he goes. Basically, he needs to come back the way he came, all the way to go to the hospital. Now, the problem is, the person that's in charge of the parade route, like where to drive, he's one of the people that's hurt. So what happens is he's not there. So the new driver basically goes the wrong way. He takes a right. Immediately, somebody's like, we're going the wrong way. And they yell, stop. And Franz Ferdinand's car stops right in front of the sandwich shop. Gavrilo Princip cannot believe it. There's the person he's supposed to assassinate, not even moving. So he drops his sandwich, pulls out his gun, walks up to the car, point blank, fires into the car. Now, was he successful? Yes. He shot Franz Ferdinand in the neck. He also accidentally shot Franz Ferdinand's wife. He later, Gavrilo Princip later said that was an accident. He wasn't aiming for the wife. He was actually aiming for the governor. But either way, they're driving to the hospital now for a different reason, to save Franz Ferdinand's life. And Franz Ferdinand's last words were, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Live for our children." And of course, she died and he died too. They both didn't make it. Now, this in a museum in this area, I mean, if you travel in Europe, you can see the infamous car that the bullets riddled with. So at that point, the assassins were put on trial. Here they are in their trial. There's Gavrilo Princip. None of them, when they took cyanide, a poison meant to kill themselves, worked. So they were found guilty. 5 were hung, but some of them were under 20 years old. So under law, you weren't allowed to have the death penalty on them. So Gavrilo Princip was put in prison for 20 years. Now, he got tuberculosis in it, and they actually died in prison. Tuberculosis was the maybe most devastating disease at the time, often proved fatal. So what ended up happening? Austria was angry. Serbia was blamed for the assassination. Serbia's like, no, we're innocent. We didn't do it. A bunch of rogue assassinations killed Franz Ferdinand, not us. But at the trial, it was proven that members, high-ranking members of the Serbian military, had provided the weapons, and they had provided the support and even issued the informal orders to do it. So Austria did blame Serbia and its military. They issued 10 demands to Serbia, called the July Ultimatum of 1914. The July Ultimatum was, do these 10 things or we're going to war. We're taking you out. And basically, it was kind of like, you're going to be a little kind of a protectorate or territory. You're going to basically do what we say. And Serbia's like, no, we were against you taking over Bosnia. We're not going to have you take over us. The most aggravating part of the 10 demands was Austria wanted to be able to put the military in Serbia to hunt down anybody that was committing acts of violence against them. Serbia wasn't about to allow that. So Serbia rejected the 10 demands, the July Ultimatum, and said, no, we'll agree to 9 of them, but not the 10th. You're not putting soldiers in our country. The Austrian Empire said, we weren't asking. Too bad for you. It is war. And Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia because of the assassination. Now, why did World War I happen? Well, these countries were all militarized, so they were prepared, ready to go. They wanted, acts of imperialism had led to the assassination. And to make things worse, they had alliances. Now, let's get into why that's important. So who's going to win this war between Austria and Serbia? Austria-Hungary is gigantic and powerful. They're going to crush Serbia. But the problem is, Serbia, the small little country there, had a big friend. Because Serbs were considered Slavic and Russia was a Slavic country, Russia saw itself as the big brother of Serbia. There's no way they're going to let Austria-Hungary push them around. Now, Russia is huge and much bigger than Austria and will crush Austria. So Austria is now scared, but the Austrians in this wave of nationalism are a German empire. Austrians are Germans, even though they've conquered many non-Germanic people. And they have a friend, Germany. Germany is a country now that's unified, and they said, we have your back, Austria-Hungary. And Germany might be the strongest country in the world at this point. They are the most militarized. They have put all of their energy not into farming, but into industry and building up their military. So they offer what was called a blank check to Austria. You know what? This is a problem between you and Russia, but we will give you as many troops as you need. We will give you an unlimited support. A blank check is when you write somebody out a check and leave the amount blank. That way you're basically saying, write in whatever you need. We'll give you unconditional support. So now Russia's in trouble because Germany is so industrialized and has such a big military that even though Russia's bigger, Germany can crush Russia. So Germany tells Russia, do not mobilize. Do not get ready for war. It's really difficult to go to war. You can't just take millions of people and suddenly make them into soldiers. You have to train them. You have to transport them. You have to give them weapons, and that's called mobilization. So it's really hard to get ready for war, to turn all your factories from producing cars to producing tanks or whatever you're producing. It takes a lot of food for these people, so you have to grow all this food to provide for your troops. It's just really hard getting ready for war. So Russia's like, no, I'm sorry, Germany. You don't tell us what to do. We're not letting Austria attack Serbia. We're going to defend them. And Russia actually starts moving their troops to the border with Austria to protect Serbia. So Germany's like, all right, we told you not to mobilize. So now Russia's in trouble because Russia can't take Germany and Austria-Hungary. But Russia has an alliance with a friend. From the old days in the 1800s, from the Triple Entente, where Russia knew that Germany was really unstoppable. So Russia teamed up with France, and they had this agreement that if Germany ever got out of hand, they would basically team up against Germany. So Russia pulls in France. Now, Germany is powerful, but they're now in trouble. Because no matter how powerful Germany is, they can't win a two-front war. They can't fight Russia and France on their western and eastern side. A two-front war would mean no matter how powerful Germany is, when they attack one country, they would then have to divide their military, which is what makes them powerful, into two militaries. And one against France, one against Russia, and that's going to mean they're half as powerful. And Germany's like, well, at half strength, I can't beat these countries. I can't win a two-front war. So Germany can't win a two-front war. But is there anything they can do now that they're in this situation? So somebody help us. Germany needs a solution. We can't beat Russia and France at the same time. And they go to their wisest general, a guy named Alfred Schlieffen, a German general. And then he comes up with something called the Schlieffen Plan. I know, a very original name. And let's look at this name. Now, Germany knows they can crush France one-on-one. They can crush Russia one-on-one. They just can't do it at the same time. So let's kind of explain what the Schlieffen Plan is. It's super complicated. The Schlieffen Plan is basically that Russia is not industrialized. They're big and clumsy. Not a lot of railroads, not a lot of factories. It's going to take them a long time to really get mobilized and get ready for war. It's going to take them a while. So the plan was to ignore Russia at first and attack France with 100% of your military. Germany knows they can crush France that way, one-on-one. Once France is defeated, move all of the German troops against Russia, and they know they can beat Russia one-on-one. Bam! Once Russia's defeated, victory! The war is won. But the plan is totally based on speed, defeating France fast before Russia can mobilize. Because if Germany attacks France and they're slow with defeating France, Russia will come and attack them from behind, and that will mean defeat for Germany. So this is a huge problem. Basically, the French armies are ready to go. They're mobilized. They're ready. They're militarized. So they're ready to fight Germany. Even if Germany can beat them, it's going to be a slow defeat. So what can Germany do to make France get defeated as quick as possible? And the answer is they don't cut on the border between Germany and France because the French are ready for that. Their armies are on that border. They instead sneak attack France through Belgium, a completely neutral, innocent country trying to stay out of it. And if Germany cuts through Belgium, France has no defenses on the Belgian border. Germans can just march to France and take over the government and win the war. So it's going to be a surprise attack. So that's exactly what happens. Germany invades Belgium, cuts through it, and is going to crush France quickly. Now, this is a great plan. The Schlieffen Plan is going to succeed. The Germans crush Belgium, crush the French. However, the speed fails. This likely victory doesn't work. Why? Because Germany's problem is that when they cut through Belgium, it turns out that Belgium had an alliance with Great Britain, that if anybody ever threatened Belgium's neutrality, Britain would come in to defend them. So Great Britain does exactly that. Great Britain enters the war against Germany to defend Belgium. Now, it's not just Britain. It's the greatest empire in the history of the world. The British Empire now goes to war with Germany. The Brits now call on all their empires to send millions of troops. And they charge in, they go into Belgium, and they fight the Germans. Now, Germany's in trouble now. Maybe they could take the French and the British together, but it would be a slow invasion, and it's entirely that. When they invade Belgium and France, they are slowed down. Russia mobilizes, and Germany now has to split their military into two groups to go fight the Russians. And now they're half as powerful, and now they're not going to be able to defeat either Russia or Great Britain and France. So what happens? Stalemate. They're now going to fight for the next 3 years, and nobody's going to really have a massive amount of success. They're even going to dig trenches, in part because of the machine gun. Machine gun is an awful military improvement, and to hide from it, they dig trenches. And the trenches, though, are absolutely great at defense. And of course, defense trumps offense, and now nobody is really able to charge the enemy and conquer land. between the trenches and machine guns. So the war turns into a stalemate, and Germany's just stuck fighting on two fronts. But there is a development. In 1917, the Russians have been getting crushed for 3 years against Germany, and they're like, we have no food, we have no bread, our people are suffering, we're losing this war, and they have a revolution. They get rid of their government. And the one thing those people are like, hey, maybe we should drop out of this war, it's making us miserable. Now the Allies are panicking. No, the Russians are going to drop out of the war. We need them to keep Germany in a two-front war. If they drop out, we're going to have to fight 100% of Germany's troops. We can't win that type of war. But there is hope. At the same time that Russia was dropping out, the United States was getting pretty close to joining the war. And if they were going to join the war, that would really help out Britain and France. Now, why wasn't the U.S. already in the war? Well, we got to go back in time a little bit. In 1914, President of the United States was President Wilson. He totally said we need to stay neutral. This is Europe's war. We got to stay out of it. Now, why? Well, Americans didn't want to join the war. We were deeply divided. We didn't even know who to support. It wasn't, Great Britain and Germany, it wasn't obvious who was the good moral power. In World War II, there was Hitler, so that Germany was the bad country, right? In World War I, there was no Hitler. Germany wasn't automatically bad. So our country was somewhat evenly split between who to support in 1914. Was it to support the British or the Germans? So the better solution was just to stay out of it. So in 1914, why were we not all in to fight Germany? There were millions and millions of Austrian and German immigrants living in the U.S., even those that were now U.S. citizens. So they supported the German and Austrians. They hated the British. So there were so many Americans that didn't want to support the British. Reason number two, we had so many Irish Americans in the United States, and the Irish Americans remembered 1,000 years of abuse of the British on the people of Ireland. It's one of the reasons they left Ireland, one of the reasons. And they were siding with the Germans because they were against the British. Three, we did not want to join Russia. Russia was teamed up with Britain and France, and Russia was, basically was an autocracy, an emperor. And we thought, no, we love democracy, but we're not going to team up with an evil emperor that can do whatever they want with their people. And basically, the people are enslaved to the leader. So we didn't want to be on that team. 3 years later, America does change its mind. We eventually go all in on the Allied side, the British and French side. Number one reason is because the Germans, remember the Schlieffen Plan, cut through Belgium and attacked and killed those neutral people. So Belgium was a kind of a relatively weak country that was neutral and innocent, and the Germans just crushed them. There were so many rumors and reports of the Germans burning down homes, raping women, thousands of women, and that now some of those stories were exaggerated, untrue, and many of them were true. And the Americans are going to see Germany as the bad guy after that invasion of Belgium. Reason number two, we switched sides or made a commitment, is at that time, news to the telegraph was sent through transatlantic cables. Under the sea, there were all these wires, still existent today, and that's how we got news. There was no satellites or cell phones, and those cables basically transmitted news somewhat instantaneously. Well, those cables, the British immediately went and cut the ones coming straight from Germany. The only news we were getting was from Britain because those cables were intact. And the British greatly exaggerated all the terrible things the Germans were doing. So this would be an example of propaganda. All the news we got was from the British. The Germans looked bad. The British looked good. Our country slowly began to support the British. Reason number three, we supported the British. Basically, our background, our ancestry. Most Americans spoke English. That came from England. We traded more with England. Basically, our ethnic biases would support us supporting that group of people. Reason number four, we had so much more trade with Britain, which meant we got the British products, British culture, we had more in common with them. We made more money off them, they made money off of us. So we actually were biased that keeping a strong friendship with Britain would be advantageous economically for us and our factories, made us money. Reason five, we chose Britain. Our political system in our country, we love freedom, we love democracy. Germany, Austria, the Ottoman Empire, they were on the other side, weren't democracies. So Britain and France were. So we loved their system. We saw this as fighting for freedom, fighting for democracy. Now, Germany, absolutely not. And Austria-Hungary, absolutely not. And Russia was not a democracy, but they're going to drop out of the war in March of 1917. Once they dropped out, it was like Britain and France were the good guys, and we could join them without limiting ourselves. So Autocracies, dictatorships, emperors, we wanted to crush. We wanted to take out Germany, Austria-Hungary. Bam. So, reason number 6 we ended up committing to Britain is Germany was sinking our ships at this time, killing our people, and that's going to anger us. Now, Great Britain blockaded Germany, and they put a blockade so that no ships could get to Germany. They also mined the waters, particularly of the North Sea, if you look on the top, and they were successful. No ships could get to Germany. So that blockade is going to make Germany desperate. Because the British blockade Germany, Germany's going to starve to death in this war. They're not going to be able to get raw materials or fertilizer or food or anything. So Germany is going to be sad because they're losing the war because the British are dominating the oceans and blockading them. So to survive, what did they do? Germany started launching submarines and surrounded Great Britain. They said the only way we can win this war is if we also blockade Britain. Now, some blockades are okay. Technically, if you're a neutral country, you're allowed to trade with warring countries, and nobody should mess with your neutral rights. And blockades are acceptable if you're basically trading war goods with somebody at war. Technically, your blockade can seize a ship, give them a warning, board. If you find war contraband, you can seize it. If you're going to sink a ship, you have to let them get on lifeboats before sinking them. But in 1917, the Germans weren't willing to do this type of blockade. They were desperate. And what do I mean? They were starving to death because of the British blockade. So they knew the only way that they could win World War I was to knock Britain out of the war. The only way they could survive, because they themselves were starving to death. Over 750,000 Germans were estimated to die from German famine during World War I because of this British blockade. The only way to win is to fight fire with fire. And in 1917, the Germans are going to implement something called unrestricted submarine warfare. What that means is they are going to sink every single ship that comes to Britain. If they can sink every single ship, not give warnings, not put their subs at risk by rising above the water to ask people kindly to get off their boats into their lifeboats, but just to sink all of them and to starve the British out of the war. So again, some blockades have legal actions. You give warnings to boats, you board them, you find evidence of war contraband, you let the people get on lifeboats. No, unrestricted submarine warfare is implemented in 1917 by Germany. You sink every boat, no warnings. Now, even sink non-military ships, neutral ships. And the United States isn't involved in this war in 1917, yet our ships were getting sunk. Now remember, 1915, the Germans sunk the Lusitania, killing 128 Americans. Afterwards, they apologized, even gave money to the U.S., to the families of the people that died. But in 1917, Germany got desperate again. After 3 years of facing the British blockade, they're starving to death. They need to win the war. They need to take Britain out. Britain's an island, so they can't invade it. So they surround it with ships, and they're going to sink submarines and sink every ship they can find. Now, this policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, implemented on January 31st, immediately sinks 4 U.S. merchant ships, killing 36 Americans. The U.S. is so angry that us as a neutral country are getting killed. Now, but was Germany wrong for attacking our ships? Was the U.S. really neutral? Now, at this point, the U.S. was trading, but not trading with Germany because it was blockaded. 1916, we traded $2.7 billion of stuff and war goods with Britain and France, almost nothing with Germany. Germany's like, you're not neutral, I can sink your ships. But the U.S. and Wilson were like, we are neutral. What's another reason why the United States wasn't neutral? Wilson completely ignored the fact that U.S. banks were funding the war. They had given $2 billion to British banks to pay for war goods. They'd given almost nothing to Germany. The difference of loans that we gave to fund this war was 100 to 1. We weren't neutral. We were funding the war for Britain. So Germany did have the right to attack our ships because our claims of you're sinking our neutral ships, not fair. Wilson also ignored the fact that British ships, in order not to get sunk by German submarines, actually flew American flags, pretended to be Americans. So the Germans were like, just because we see American flags on your ships, they're probably British ships. So we're going to have to sink all ships. That's the only way we can attack Britain. And what did the United States do to Britain for flying American flags, which then put our ships at risk? Nothing. Wilson ignored it. Wilson also ignored that the British ships actually stopped American ships that were trying to trade with Germany, stopped them, forced them into British harbors, took the war goods we were trying to sell. This is totally illegal under international law. But Wilson was like, I don't want to go to war with Britain. We're trying to stay out of this war. Plus, they're just taking our stuff. Germany's actually sinking and killing our people. Property is different from people. So Wilson ignored all the terrible things Britain did, but didn't ignore what Germany did. Now, it got to the point where our Secretary of State under Wilson, William Jennings Bryan, said, you know what? We're going to get sucked into this war. We're not acting neutral. Germany's going to attack us, and we're going to get sucked into the war. What we need to do is stay neutral. Stop giving Britain loans and stop trading with Britain alone. And he suggests, let's ban Americans from traveling on foreign ships. Let's do that ban. Now, immediately Wilson says, no, I'm not going to do that. Now, what was happening was Americans would go to Britain and be on their ships, and then those British ships would get sunk, and then Wilson would get angry, and Americans would get angry that Germany was killing Americans. But it wasn't fair, because the U.S. could have said, no, Americans couldn't go on British ships. British ships are getting sunk. But it was almost like Wilson was looking for an excuse, Americans to get killed, so that he could enter the war. So you could make a case. William Jennings Bryan made the case as Secretary of State of the United States that we are not being neutral. We are trading with Britain alone. We're giving loans to Britain to fund their war. We're ignoring the British that are violating our neutral rights on our ships, taking our stuff. And we're not banning American travel on British ships. So our Americans are dying. We could easily avoid this. He actually resigns his position because he's like, Wilson, you're not being neutral. You're going to get Germany to attack us. Regardless, the U.S. is massively angry that Germany is sinking our neutral ships. And basically, it's just a matter of time before the U.S. joins. So Germany gets an idea. They're like, well, we're sinking U.S. ships, and the U.S. is getting angry about it. They're going to hop in the war. If the U.S. hops in this war, we're going to lose. So Germany gets an idea. They send a telegram called the Zimmermann telegram to Mexico because they know that Mexico and the U.S. aren't getting along. Do you remember Pancho Villa and all that? So sends a note, and this is the literal Zimmermann telegram that bribes Mexico. It says, Mexico, 70 years ago, back in the 1840s, you went to war with the U.S. It was called the Mexican-American War. And you lost that war. The U.S. took half your country, which is now the American Southwest. And when the U.S. took that, you got very sad. It was a huge loss. So the Zimmermann telegram says, Germany is sinking U.S. ships, and U.S. is going to come into World War I, and that's going to be bad for Germany. So why don't you, Mexico, attack the United States? And if you attack them and keep them busy, I then will defeat Britain and France without the U.S. being in the war. And then I will send my troops over to attack the U.S. And when we together beat the U.S., I'll give you back that land that the U.S. took, specifically Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. This is called the Zimmermann telegram. Now, the U.S. was angry. How dare you sink our ships, but also violate our neutrality, but also bribe our neighbor to attack us? So the U.S., that was enough is enough. The U.S. declares war. And Wilson speaks to Congress and says, I know many of you don't want to go to war, but right is more precious than peace. The world has to be made safe for democracy. These evil emperors need to be eliminated. This will be the war to end all wars. Basically, we'll eliminate all of these dictators. Once the people take over all the countries, nobody will embrace imperialism and the whole world will be safe. So what ends up happening? In 1917, the United States enters the war after the Zimmermann telegram. We rescue Britain and France, and even they would acknowledge that. We send in millions of troops. And basically, Britain and France were so unbelievably tired after 3 years of fighting, and Germany was so unbelievably beat up. When the U.S. comes in, ready to fight, absolutely not tired, we knock Germany out. We tip the balance. So what ended up causing this war again? A massive sense of militarism, imperialism, sense of desire to conquer, assassination in Sarajevo, a wave of nationalism, desire for revolution, and of course, the final reason was alliances. This war should have only been between two countries, between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, but they all had friends and secret alliances, and they pulled each other in. Now, the central powers would turn out to be the Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. They would be the powers, the bad guys from the U.S. perspective. Now, Italy was actually originally in that group, but they're going to stay out of the war and then switch to the Allies. And the Allied powers are basically going to be the United Kingdom, France, Serbia, and Russia. Those are your first four. Now, a bunch of everybody else is going to join in. They're called the Allied powers. Eventually, it's going to be 32 powers, 28 versus 4. And that is going to make this a huge world war. This war should have been 2 countries. Turns out to be a world war because of all these alliances and all of this militarism, desire for empire. So many lessons. Now, in conclusion, we end up having a pretty awful peace. For a year straight, all these countries try to figure out what to do after this war, after Germany loses, after the US enters and defeats Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And we end up punishing Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire so badly, all they think about is the desire for revenge. So you can make a case that the peace of World War I planted the seeds of World War II, which was a disaster. So look for your assignment in Google Classroom. Thank you for listening.